Culture. What is it and why do we need to understand it? First, we have to understand cultural differences because it's the cultural differences that cause the underlying problems that then erupt into issues in our classrooms. It causes tensions because we misunderstand one another or we misattribute something due to the cultural differences. Cultural differences also cause us to come up with stereotypes, which in most cases are not true, and then cause further problems. And the communication gaps are very obvious in the cultural differences. Culture is like an iceberg. Uh, each Each of the things that we think of as culture, things like music and art, food, drink, the way somebody dresses, the outward behaviors that someone has, those are all things that we think of as culture, but they really aren't what is culture in a deeper sense. And so that deeper sense is the iceberg that you see, the 90% that's basically what we call underwater in this iceberg. The submerged part of the iceberg is what threatens the ship. Similarly, it's this deeper, larger part of the iceberg of culture, which we call the small c of culture, that really threatens our classrooms and our interactions with families of immigrants in our classrooms. The surface or big C aspects are visible, they're easily learned, easily adapted, often celebrated, but what lies underneath affects all of our interactions. Some of that surface culture includes ceremonies, marriages, births and deaths, ethics, family ties, gestures. But when we get into the deeper culture, we begin to see why we do those things. We begin to see the orientations that each person has to how they regard time, how they regard actions, how they regard space around them, power, individualism, competitiveness or cooperativeness, and those types of things. So as we go deeper into this, you'll see how that happens. There is no culture that is better than another. Culture just is. We all have culture. It's not congenital. We're not born with it necessarily. It's acquired through the things that we're exposed to. It's possible to be in between cultures and move along a continuum of cultural differences, especially those people who move around learn to adapt very quickly, and while they may not change the way they approach things or their worldview or their beliefs, they appear to have acculturated when they move into a new culture and are there for a while. When you're learning about a culture, you learn generalizations, and not everybody fits that generalization. But as you learn those generalizations, say about a particular Asian culture or a particular South American culture, you'll see some carryover to other cultures that are from that same part of the world sometimes. In understanding a different culture, one must be willing to step out of his or her own culture and get a perspective from outside. As you go through this and as you consider how you can help your students, try not to be critical, try not to dismiss any particular cultural differences, just try to see them and understand them as best you can. We have some constraints to our cultural understanding just by the nature of what this is. The cognitive restraints are our frame of reference or our worldview, and even within one culture we have different worldviews. But whatever your worldview is, however you approach the world, is the way that you filter the information that you receive about others. We have behavioral constraints because every culture has its own rules of behavior, written and unwritten, which affect our verbal and our nonverbal communication to a great extent. And we have emotional constraints. Some cultures are very expressive, others keep everything hidden. Some cultures suppress things so that you don't have any feeling of emotion. So there's a huge variation. Why does intercultural conflict happen? some of those causes are our miscommunications, our misattributions, our expectations, and our values, which you'll see. Cultural variability factors. Some of the big ones are that some cultures value individualism while others value collectivism, how we view hierarchy, formality, and power distance, our perceptions of ourselves, low context cultures versus high context cultures, and the ideas of being versus doing. These things and others influence the way we attribute meaning to events, values we hold in approaching or avoiding conflict, and the way we communicate. Let's look first at individualism versus collectivism. In individualism, the person emphasizes the individual identity over the group identity, the individual rights over the group obligations. This is very obvious in American culture. There's a strong assertion of personal opinions, display of personal emotions, the importance of personal accountability in this type of society. Collectivism, on the other hand, emphasizes group identity and in-group oriented concerns over individual wants and desires. Collective opinions or ideas, restraint of personal emotional expression, and protection of the members of the group. You might see this in a South American society, so that if you have several students who've come from that kind of setting, maybe Hispanic, you'll see that they value working together much more than what they do as an individual, and they may even share answers, which you may see as cheating, and to them that is not cheating, that's helping one another. So you have to look at how they're viewing that and help them understand how we view it. The next area has to do with hierarchical, formal, and power distance. On the left again you'll see what American society values. People are respected for their personal attributes rather than their position. You assume no power distance, but that can be mistaken as control by another culture when they're taking initiative. In other cultures, you'll see that persons are valued differently based on their race, their caste, their gender. Status and priority of treatment are ascribed to them based on their importance in that society. Power distance. Most of those people are very comfortable with unequal distribution of power and with having a person of authority telling others what to do. You may see Americans balking at what their boss tells them. People from other cultures, for example from India, would never think of balking or complaining about what someone over them tells them what to do. How people see themselves, very different between cultures. Some cultures see the self as autonomous, self-reliant, unencumbered, rational choice makers. They practice very direct verbal communication. They make sense of their environment. They're concerned with presenting themselves credibly and competently. But each person is pretty much their own person in that situation. Other cultures are very interdependent. Again, you've got the in-group bound situation, getting along with everybody, having harmony, being concerned with what others think of that self-image. They practice responsive communication by anticipating thoughts and feelings of the other. And in these cultures, losing face or honor is very, very big, very real, affects everything that they do. Here again, think of a culture such as the Korean culture and how important it is not to lose face. Low context cultures communicate through explicit verbal messages, straight talk. The sender is the person who is the communicator and is responsible for getting a message across that can be understood. That would be the American culture. A high context culture is just the opposite. Communication is conveyed through a variety of things such as social roles, position, nonverbal communication, and in this case the listener is expected to understand the communication by reading between the lines, understanding what's being inferred, knowing what the message should be based on the person's position and the context of the event in which this is taking place. Other differences are that the high context cultural person would assume that there's no distinction between the idea and the person. Therefore, if an idea is rejected, it's a rejection of that person as well. An experience includes one's interpretation of it, not just the facts, but how they interpret those facts. And life is seen very holistically, so it's difficult to make distinctions between a wrong act and the person who committed the wrong act. On the other hand, here in America, we compartmentalize our lives, we compartmentalize our issues, and so we don't see those things as interrelated nearly as much as many other cultures do. And the content, what actually happened, the facts of what happened, become more important than the context of what happened. Another huge difference between cultures is the difference between the orientation to doing versus the orientation to being. And that has to do with how you act, it has to do with who you value and what you value in your world. Doing cultures, like the American culture, value results, they value materialism, they value what you've accomplished during the day, what you've accomplished in a textbook, what you've accomplished toward a goal, what you've accomplished on a test. Interpersonal conflict resolution follows an outcome-oriented model that emphasizes the importance of moving quickly toward the phase of reaching goals and outcomes. Those societies that put value on being are going to look much more at relationships and the quality of life. And interpersonal conflict resolution follows a process-oriented model, emphasizing the importance of group or mutual face interests before tangible goals or outcomes can even be discussed. And so approaching things so that nobody loses face, nobody is told how wrong they are or that this is not the right way to do it, is much more important, making them feel like they're okay and it can be fixed, but it has to be fixed through a relationship. There's subtle negotiation of those face-related issues, big issues of pride, honor, dignity, insult, shame, trust, respect, and prestige all come before tangible goals. Cross-cultural understanding and acceptance take time and effort. The key for the intercultural educator is to be sensitive, flexible, and open. Promoting academic achievement for all students involves organizing a variety of classroom activities that promote learning and communication for various cultural and learning styles.